Let's go!
Biggest news of the day, at least for me, and this might not be news for everybody else, is that Harada dropped some absolute insane truth bangers in regard to the history of Tekken and a rivalry between Dead or Alive and Tekken that had been going on for a very long time, like almost 20 years. For those that are unaware of the history behind this, Itagaki-san, who is the lead Dead or Alive guy, lead old school or Xbox era Ninja Gaiden guy, we're playing like one of his games right now, had a mega beef with Harada around the late 90s, early 2000s. There was a constant entanglement between Harada and this dude, and it can be summed up extremely well with this image right here. In a magazine back in like the 2000s, Itagaki was sort of like the rock star of the video game industry, right? But also a very arrogant dude. Granted, he was quite good. He was making some pretty bangerific games. His top 5 most hated games in no particular order: Tekken, Tekken 2, Tekken 3, Tekken 4, and Tekken 5. I can no longer figure out what the hell they're trying to do with numbering. And I don't know which one is which. I don't know what they're trying to do with all these spin-offs. So this includes Nina Death by Degrees. I don't think it even needs saying, but people should stay away from Tekken. Nothing left to say. I just don't want them to disappoint me anymore. It's so annoying. Please don't annoy me anymore. So yeah, this very much was a well-known beef. If you had video game magazines, you knew who Itagaki was, you know his games were really cool, you knew what Tekken was. You didn't really know exactly who Harada was at the time as much. It was like they were always butting heads, is what it felt like. But was that the case the entire time? Was Harada and Itagaki actually blood-sworn enemies? Usually things aren't entirely that way. Some people might think that Harada and Ono were blood-sworn enemies during the Street Fighter Cross Tekken era, but that was absolutely a facade to build a rivalry that people could follow in some way. With that being said, somebody had a tweet, and they're like, hey, Harada, evidence of this when he was friends with Itagaki from DOA that literally had it printed in no particular order. Okay. Harada-san jumps in with the holy Harada's sitting here on his phones, and he's like, beep, 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 and reads this, and he's like, that's a stupid bitch. And then he looks at his watch and says, I have 2.5 hours. And he just started going crazy. Let's just get into it. You wrote half a book on this, Harada-san. And the previous times Harada's gone into a lot of detail of the video game industry in the past, I very much appreciate, and it has been super fascinating. So lock in, chat. I'm not sure how you perceive my relationship with Mr. Itagaki, but I can tell you it's likely different from what you imagine. Let me provide a general overview and some key topics regarding my history. However, consider this a warning. What follows is content that would normally be covered in media interview articles and is strongly advised any impatient fighting game fans out there to stop reading now. No, scratch that. This is a serious warning. If you have a typical level of patience and common sense, you're better off not reading further. So if you didn't get that far, this is definitely not for you, is what he's saying. If you do, there's a high chance you'll either give up midway, fall asleep, or subject yourself to the pain of endless scrolling even on a 100-inch tall vertical smartphone screen. And I appreciate Harada's castness here. Even then, I've omitted most of the events and focused on only the major incidents. Let me make this clear. I'm warning you ahead of time. If anyone dares to respond with too long after this, they'll be sent straight to their ancestors' graves and permanently muted. Why? Because I specifically said don't read this. Now, what I'm about to discuss happening during the old Namco era has almost nothing to do with the post-merger Bandai Namco era, so younger gen employees who joined after may consider yourself exempt from all this context. Please forgive any translation errors or nuances that I might have misinterpreted. I'm still stuck at the English level of my university days. Yes, I've warned you about everything. You should not read further. You'll regret it if you do. Chapter 1. First contact. It was first during the 1990s when the Dead or Alive series was announced. On the way back from a game show, I happened to run into Sega's Virtua Fighter team, who would later become the heads of Sega AM2. Coincidentally, Itagaki also appeared. The key people behind VF, Tekken, and DOA were also there by chance, so we decided to take advantage of the opportunity and went out for drinks at an izakaya in Shinjuku. A reminder, chat, all critical conversations this side the video game industry in Japan all take place in izakayas over drinks. Every single major deal that has ever gone down between any of these big heads at these companies is always between sake shots at an izakaya. It is crazy. Him and two members of Sega AM2 got into an animated discussion about technical topics, and at the time, Namco shared some animation control tech with Sega through engineers we had headhunted from Sega. So of course, just a few years later, the Tekken project independently developed its own animation control technology from scratch. And yes, the people kind of responsible for Virtua Fighter 1 went over to Bandai Namco to help them make Tekken. Yeah, there's a lot of literal crossing of the industry in the exact same ways that Capcom had, where several ex-Capcom people from the Street Fighter 2 era went to SNK to help them make all of their games, you know? The knowledge and foundation technologies developed from the Tekken project at the time would become the very origins of Bandai Namco's human action development technologies. Surprisingly, many Bamco employees are unaware of this fact that Tekken is the ancestor of Bandai Namco's Polygon era animation and action control tech. Without this foundation, it's self-evident we wouldn't have been able to co-develop Smash Brothers with Mr. Sakurai. Mr. Itagaki listened with great interest as I and the Sega executives discussed these topics, and later we bonded over casual, non-work related chatter about games. One moment stands out even after 30 years. Itagaki said to me, "Mr. Harada, you are a really approachable and funny person." And at the time, Itagaki still addressed me using polite language. And of course, I did the same for him. In other words, we didn't know much about each other yet, and our relationship was very professional and gentlemanly of the time. Chapter 2, What Itagaki Discovered. A few months after the VF Tekken and DOA drinking session, I happened to run into Mr. Itagaki again at another gaming event. He approached me and said, "Harada, you're from Waseda University, aren't you? I also went to Waseda, and our time there overlapped. That makes you my junior." I responded, "I might be your junior, but I don't think we were there at the same time." However, he said, "No, I was busy with Mahjong every day that it took me 7 years to graduate. I'm sure we were there at the same time. In fact, I remember seeing you during our university days. You were the captain of the yacht racing team, were you not?" Itagaki had thoroughly researched his background and discovered that he was his junior. From then on, he started referring to Harada as his junior and speaking to him in a casual tone of a senior addressing a junior, dropping the polite language entirely. Chapter 3, The Beginnings of Itagaki's Media Strategy. Mr. Itagaki wasn't just a game designer or a director. More than anything, he was starting to show his prowess as a producer. This became clear after he left Tecmo, when he explicitly told him as much. Back then, he began seriously thinking about how to elevate DOA to surpass Tekken in terms of marketing and branding. Let's rewind a bit to the past. During that time, the arcade gaming market was thriving. Sega and Namco were two giants dominating in the arcades. Not only did they develop games, they also operated their own arcade chains domestically, internationally, managing a significant share of game distribution and publishing. This was when the arcade industry was multi-billion dollars, Chad, like absolutely freaking huge. Itagaki recognized that Tecmo couldn't compete against this level of marketing and publishing. So as a result, he explored media strategies using not only print magazines, but also emerging internet media at the time. Despite his outwardly emotional demeanor, Itagaki had a very cool and calculated eye for analyzing resources and strategy. Among his various strategies was one to deliberately bite at Tekken to draw media attention. In doing so, he even called me out by name and criticized Tekken's game design and other aspects. So let me emphasize, this was just one of many strategies he employed, not his only approach. An uneven relationship. Due to the media strategy he just described, the Tekken project team was instantly or initially baffled. In one magazine, for instance, Itagaki used a 2-page spread to openly criticize Tekken, his name, delivering a highly aggressive interview. Overseas magazines and internet media, especially in the West, attacks escalated even further, harsher criticisms. Meanwhile, I was ordered by my superiors at Namco to remain completely silent. In other words, I was strictly forbidden to respond in any way to Itagaki's attacks. The dynamic of Harada remained silent while Itagaki attacks lasted for about 10 years, from the late 1990s till around 2007, after the release of DOA 4 at the end of 05. And looking back, it's clear that under these circumstances, there was absolutely no chance for Mr. Itagaki and me to develop a friendly relationship. In fact, during those 10 years, I spent much of my time wondering, why is this guy so fixated on targeting and attacking me? Chapter 5, The Sudden Summons Incident. Let's rewind to 1998. Out of the blue, Itagaki called Namco, directly asking for Harada. As I mentioned earlier, he had already been starting his media strategy targeting Tekken, learned that Harada was a junior from university. Given the strained relationship he had with him at the time, his call left him deeply confused. So cautiously, Harada picked up the phone, and Itagaki responded, "Could you come to Tecmo's headquarters? Just you, alone." It reminded me of a summons by a delinquent upperclassman behind the school building back in middle school. For a moment, I considered declining, but in the end, my curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to the request and headed to Tecmo's headquarters the following day, alone. When I arrived, Mr. Itagaki himself greeted me and led me into a small room. There, I saw something covered with a cloth that looked like an arcade cabinet. Like a magician performing a stage act, he dramatically removed the cover with a flourish. Underneath, an arcade cabinet CRT monitor revealing something for the very first time, the development build of Dead or Alive 2, which had not been announced. You're the first outsider to see this screen, he said. More than the game itself, I was bewildered by the magician-like presentation. That aside, he had two main purposes for summoning me. First, he wanted to sell more DOA 2 boards to the arcade market. At the time, Sega and Namco were the two largest buyers of arcade boards due to their extensive arcade chain, so normally he would have approached Namco's sales team and he would have felt that wasn't enough. Instead, he sought validation from a developer like him, hoping that the endorsement would lead to Namco purchasing more DOA 2 boards. Second, he wanted to gauge DOA 2's performance and see how the Tekken project would react. If I so much as scoffed at DOA 2, he would take it as evidence that the Tekken had superior technology and confidence. But on the other hand, if he showed any signs of being impressed or unsettled, he would use that as a benchmark to compare that to Team Ninja's position and the Tekken project. So, after presenting the concept briefly, he said, "All right, give it a try." When I pressed the start button, he sat down right next to him. As if they were about to face off, Harada chose Kasumi under unspoken pressure and began playing. Just seconds into the match, after pressing the punch button 3 times, he asked, "Well, what do you think?" After 3 punches, I was completely thrown off. What could I possibly judge after a few seconds? I instinctively replied, "It feels good to play." I expected him to retort with, "How could you know after just a few seconds?" Instead, he responded with, "See, I told you, Harada." At that moment, I was genuinely confused. Was this man serious? Was this some sort of weird hidden camera prank? To be fair, DOA 2 was already demonstrating impressive technical achievements for the time, even in this unfinished state. However, his insistence on immediate feedback and constant explanations while I played left me overwhelmed with information. Later, I learned from a former Team Ninja member that after my visit, Itagaki returned to the development floor and declared, "Today, we beat Tekken." While I was merely startled by his approach, he took it as proof that I was overwhelmed by DOA 2's performance. Chapter 6, Itagaki's analysis and strategy. Later, Itagaki explained that he had felt significant sense of accomplishment from his media strategy at the time. His aggressive stance against rival titles clearly led to a significant increase in readership, especially in the West. He told me that this approach, while unpopular in Japan, where comparative advertising was frowned upon, was super effective overseas. Additionally, Itagaki was known by some of his vast knowledge of global history and military affairs, particularly World War II. He likened the relationship between DOA and Tekken to actual warfare. He believed that winning a war required thorough reconnaissance of the enemy's resources, so he conducted a detailed analysis of the Tekken project's capabilities. In his personal office, he even displayed a chart analyzing Tekken project team's strength. He began with the game's staff credits, meticulously investigating the educational background, career history, skills, and achievements of every individual listed. This is how he discovered, as mentioned earlier, he was his junior at Waseda University. He also analyzed the order in which the names appeared in the credits, finding patterns. Those listed at the top of each unit were not necessarily core technician contributors. Instead, they were likely managers, skilled people in management or senior staff. But according to Itagaki, my presence as a young team leader at the time didn't align with these patterns, which made him a standout and an unusual one to keep tabs on. He was correct in this assessment. At the time, I was privileged to work with brilliant individuals, some 10 years my senior directors programmers regarded as geniuses. These senior colleagues provided me with exceptional support, allowing me to lead game design in an environment where I was, in a sense, spoiled. They often asked, "Harada, what do you want to do? What do you need? We'll provide anything." It was an extraordinary setup that made me something of an anomaly in this industry. When our rivalry ended, Itagaki showed me his analysis chart during a later conversation, and he was astonished by its accuracy. It identified key figures in the Tekken project who were instrumental at the time. Seeing it left me with an eerie feeling. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, when the gaming industry had yet established the sophisticated marketing analysis, Itagaki had a detailed understanding of Tekken's sales figures and customer demographics. Using this data, he developed strategies to elevate DOA's brand recognition by directly opposing Tekken in the media. At the same time, his product development strategy avoided head-on collisions with Tekken. Instead, he identified needs that Tekken did not fulfill, and areas where DOA could excel technically and create a distinct direction for his game. This is why DOA DOA ultimately offered gameplay and targeted a market audience different from Tekken's. Taking a pause note here, this is mad smart. This is hella smart, dude. This can be applied to things like single player content, just like what the game is doing, what are our competitors doing, what are they doing well. Let's not do what they do well, let's do the other things well. Make the tits bigger. To give them credit, you know, DOA games are super feature rich and like a lot of stuff. So ultimately speaking, it wasn't just the boba. There's a lot of stuff to DOA games, especially in that Xbox era of DOA. That's kind of mind blowing that they put so much of this into like a fighting game. After the war. After Mitagaki left Tecmo in 2008, he called him. At the time, the dynamic hadn't changed much from the previous 10 years. He still perceived the relationship as adversarial. Yet, there he was, calling him again. He invited me to dinner, where he shared that he had left Tecmo. During the meal, he said something surprising. "Harada, you were always my comrade in arms." I realized then that this was how he saw our relationship. He explained his strategies and thoughts from that time in detail, stating explicitly, "I never had any grudge against you, Namco or Tekken. On the contrary, I respected you all. When I compared the power dynamics in development, sales, and publishing, it was clear that a straightforward approach would not work. I had to employ every strategy I could. I'm sorry for everything." He then turned the tables and asked about Tekken strategies, particularly in terms of development, production, branding, marketing. I explained that many things, but emphasized this. Since the 90s, he's been visiting arcade venues worldwide to see how people were engaging with his games. He also met with numerous arcade operators and distributors. And around the late 90s, he quickly noticed the rapid decline of the arcade market in the West. This signaled that the battleground for fighting games was shifting from arcades to home consoles. More importantly, the value of one play for 25 cents was disappearing. The incentive for the winning player to keep playing on a single coin was fading, as was the risk of losing coins for the losing player. This fundamentally changed the value perception of what a fighting game is as a form of entertainment. Realizing this, we shifted the Tekken strategy towards establishing fighting games as a viable product for home consoles. As you may know, Tekken was ahead of its time in the genre, having developed and released modes like Tekken Ball, belt action modes like Tekken Force, pre-rendered movies for stories that went beyond the typical scope of an arcade-based fighting game. In addition to this, I explained to him how I became aware of the emergence of community events, especially in North America, and arcades began to decline. At the time, these events were at grassroots levels. They ranged from gatherings at universities, in people's houses, and over time they grew into larger tournaments hosted in hotel ballrooms and gymnasiums. I recognized the potential of these events early on and began providing behind-the-scenes support to those communities. Specifically, we offered free rentals of arcade cabinets for the game boards, took care of transport and setup, occasionally provided small prizes like posters for tournament winners, because you couldn't provide official money. But in fact, many veteran players in their 40s and 50s today may not have known my name or who I was back then, but some might remember seeing me quietly setting up arcade machines at those venues without even wearing sunglasses back then. And during the time, Street Fighter had gone into a decade-long hibernation following Street Fighter 3. And the decline of arcades accelerated as the gaming markets shifted. Even as other fighting game series disappeared, I focused on maintaining both an active home console market and a foothold on the Asian arcade market. In fact, the method of constantly releasing new games in the series without a break and using huge profits made from the arcade boards and in-game purchases to fund the development of console versions was surprisingly able to continue all the way to Tekken 7. This included supporting the grassroots tournament community, the FGC, and keeping our business development going. And as like a reminder, chat, how big this arcade market was, this was like buying a car, selling 10,000 cars, and that's actually like in many ways successful. That doesn't seem like a lot. Like you only sold 10,000 cars, that feels like nothing, but no, an arcade machine was practically like purchasing a vehicle. And even in the time frame back when these arcade machines were being purchased, they were still very expensive. That's what they were selling. This super big luxury arcade experience that's like a car, and you just got to sell 10 to 20 to 30,000 of them, you know? So at the time, I can confidently say that very few developers were paying attention to the growing tournament scene in the West. How do I know this? Because those years, I was often the only Japanese dev on site, personally delivering cabinets and boards to observing events. While marketing representatives from various companies were present, I rarely saw anybody engaging directly with these communities. This approach allowed Tekken to continue its numbered releases steadily, even though the winter of the arcade market was happening. While the Virtua Fighter series fell silent, we expanded into the Western market and secured a significant share. I believe that when I faced my own hardships, no one would come to my aid, but the support from my external entity, namely the core fighting game community in the market, would be the only thing I could rely on. So he told Itagaki that he had kept this strategy under wraps, neither sharing it with other teams in the company, nor discussing it with developers from other companies. He just worked on it quietly. Upon hearing this, he was surprised and said, "What? That's not what a developer is supposed to do. Really? You are more action-oriented than I expected." It seemed that he had a stereotypical image of the developers born in the 70s. Nerds who just stayed in their offices, glued to monitors, endlessly coding. But to be fair, this was also part of his work, but by the late 90s, I was using development downtime between projects to travel around the world. And an end to the conflict, the end of our story. Through this exchange of past strategies, I finally resolved my long-standing feud with Itagaki-san. This happened in about the late 2008. After that, every year-end, I've received a drunken phone call from him, which became something of a tradition. That said, I haven't received one this year. What a goddamn story. This also absolutely reflects things that Harada has said on Harada's Bar about the 3D fighting game era. This stuff is what the Tekken team was maybe not as vocally doing to the Virtua Fighter team. Harada loved competition. He felt when Sega would do something unique, different, new, and challenging in Virtua Fighter, it was kind of a call to arms for the Tekken project to step up. These guys are doing this. We have to beat that. We have to beat that and match that. And if there's one thing that Harada definitely had the right idea for, even though he wasn't a direct developer in many of these situations, he was right. He was getting his market share for his game that was much more effective than what Virtua Fighter was doing, which in many situations of VF releases was still just an arcade game. It would take until like a Virtua Fighter 4, a Virtua Fighter 4 Evo, where those games would actually have a significant amount of content in them at launch. And to be honest, even later games like Virtua Fighter 5 were not super content-rich games. They were mostly just very pretty arcade games that came out on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, with functioning online at least. So Harada had the right idea. He saw that like, all right, so just releasing an arcade game and having an arcade game just be the home experience of that arcade game is not something that is going to be commercially viable for that long of a time. Itagaki, also pretty damn smart, knowing that Tekken has such a large sharehold, Tekken and Virtua Fighter has such a large share of that fighting game space, took advantage of effectively fabricated drama to sort of build DOA as a brand. And yeah, dude, I absolutely, in the same ways that Sega does what Nintendo don't, the console rivalries of the 90s, getting kids to aggressively defend one side of consoles or the other, that's kind of what they were doing to build their grassroots following, to sort of build people that were willing to defend Dead or Alive over something like Tekken and try to sell you on why DOA is better. You know? Of course, America was really into that shit, which is why I think DOA's market was obviously the biggest in the US in the Xbox era, because it was also an Xbox. With that being said, did Itagaki ever actually feel that Tekken was terrible? Were these the actual thoughts of a functioning person with a human brain? No, Itagaki never hated Tekken. He always saw them as their rival, their competitor, in the exact same way that Harada always looked at Virtua Fighter as their rival and competitor, and used them as a basis to sort of allow the development team that they had to elevate themselves. We have to do better than this. We have to meet our fans at some place in the middle where they do not have this thing.